evening, everybody, again. I hope everyone enjoyed their dinner. It's now my pleasure to introduce Captain David Morgan, who's going to speak to us about the sustainability initiatives of Air New Zealand going forward. Just to give you a little bit of a background, David has been with Air New Zealand since 1985, when he was started flying on Fokker Friendships. While I was looking David up on the internet, I came across a media article in 2016 when he was interviewed by Grant Bradley of the New Zealand Herald, who's quite a prolific aviation writer. And back in 2016, David was actually talking about alternative fuels and also things like trying to save increase fuel economy by putting winglets on things like the Boeing 767s and things like that. So at that time, David was Deputy Chair of the New Zealand Business Sustainable Council, and he's still involved with that council today. So David is a Senior Executive with Air New Zealand as their Chief Operations Integrity Officer and a pilot. He's a Fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. Just at the last AGM for Aviation Industry Association, which is the peak body for aviation in New Zealand, he was elected as the Vice President. And David's been very supportive of our branch, and just last year he was back here in this very same venue supporting an awards evening at which Brian was one of the recipients of the award. So it's obviously a very interesting topic and quite a challenging one. David was just talking about how many litres or gallons of fuel Air New Zealand burns a year, and moving to a different, moving away into different futures is actually something that's going to be quite challenging. So David, you're welcome to join us. Thank you.
Thanks. Pleasure. Thank you. Lovely to be here. Great to see the future of New Zealand aviation sitting at the table here. Welcome. Good to see you. Makes the august older folk. When you start talking about me flying since 1985, or joining Air New Zealand in 1985, it seems a very long time ago. This is the Jean Batten address, and it's important that we do, thinking in terms of aviation history, remember Jean Batten, a pioneering woman aviator. She was inspired by Charles Lindbergh, who of course is famous, for those of the younger ones maybe who don't know, was the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic when she was 19. When she was 21, she decided that she wanted to fly from England to Australia, and she did that after being given the opportunity to fly with Sir Charles Kingsford Smith over in Australia, and then subsequently, of course, did that flight when she was 21, and then when she was nearly 28, she flew from Europe to New Zealand in something like 11 days, and then she was finished for her flying career, and then unfortunately sort of disappeared off the radar and sort of died in obscurity in Spain after being bitten by a dog, and is buried somewhere in Spain in an unmarked grave. And but she was a pioneering woman, and it wasn't easy for women to be pioneers, particularly in aviation back in the day. So it's important that we do remember her, and I'm pleased to have been asked to talk to you tonight about sustainability, but in the context of the Jean Batten address. And it's an important thing on the calendar of the society, of which I'm proudly, as has been said, a fellow. I'm talking tonight about sustainability. Why do I want to talk about that? Well, if you think in terms of how Jean Batten would have navigated her way across the globe, it's really quite interesting, isn't it? She would have stayed in sight of the ground, and she had some challenges on her first flight. Of course, she ran out of fuel around Rome, and while she was flying near Karachi, she was brought down by a sandstorm, and But anyway, she got through there and must be in New Zealand, is it? Beat Amy Johnson's record for the flight out to Australia. But the way she got there would have been very basic and compared to what we do today. But even in the time that I joined Air New Zealand, I remember in the DC-8, I was visiting a DC-8 one day. It was a big jet back in 1985. Air New Zealand had, at that stage, its international airline more or less consisted of 5 747-200s and a DC-8 freighter, and that was it. I remember asking one of the guys, "What's that thing on the ceiling in the cockpit, in the flight deck?" And it was a place where you could put the sextant through, you know, in order to take a star shot or a sun shot, you know, just sort of highlighted, and that particular sextant has actually been retained by the navigation department of Air New Zealand and now sits in a glass case actually outside my office at Auckland Airport, because we keep a bit of the memorabilia and what have you. But it just goes to show you how, you know, we're not that long ago when I started, it wasn't that long before that they stopped using the sextant, certainly held on to it and occasionally made people try and work out where they were by judging where the position of the sun or the stars and what have you. By all accounts, that particular orifice that was in the ceiling of the aeroplane was actually quite handy for getting rid of apple cores, etc. and what have you. But how things have changed, and things will continue to change. And one of the things that's going to change is the way we think about how we operate the aeroplanes and the type of aeroplanes that we operate and what we use to operate or to make them stay in the air, because we're going to have to do that, because we're going to have to come up with a solution to the problem that we have, and that is the effect that aviation has on climate change, and climate change is real. Screen. Okay, I'll just come around here if I may so I can see actually what it is it says. So aviation is, oops, I've got to stand back a bit because I'm getting a bit of feedback. So aviation, of course, is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas, of course, causes the heating of the atmosphere, and as a consequence of that, the Earth is heating up. And that actually has some real material effects as far as aviation is concerned. As far as New Zealand is concerned, of course, there is a significant, in the context of New Zealand, aviation actually contributes to about 6% of the total emissions in the country. So it's sort of over-indexed, and one of the reasons for that is that because of our geographical isolation means that we're over-indexed when it comes to fuel in the international operation. So you can see there 83% of this is the international network, and then just 17% for the domestic one. And one of the things that you have to remember too, not just from an operational perspective, but from a financial perspective, that for every kilo of fuel that is consumed by the aeroplane, and it's a lot, Air New Zealand uses around about 365,000 litres of fuel per hour, which is quite a bit. And when I'm flying the 787, for example, which I do every week or so, it's quite interesting to note that the aeroplane actually gets lighter by 100 kilos every 65 seconds or so. So just over a minute, it's just about 65 to 70 seconds. Every 65 to 70 seconds, 100 kilos of fuel is consumed in order to oppose the force of gravity. Because that's what we need the energy for. And but when you do that, you actually produce 300 and something kilos of CO2. And one of the more interesting things about CO2 is that it's actually traded as a carbon is traded, and a tonne of carbon is about $200. And so therefore, you know, we'll produce for every tonne of fuel that we consume, which is about $1,000 a tonne, and for a flight, you know, to San Francisco or something, we'll consume about 80 tonnes, so it's $80,000. We'll also produce 240,000 tonnes of CO2, and that's at $200 a tonne. So there's not only a sustainability effect of carbon, but also a financial one as well. It's considered by the board, the executive, and Air New Zealand as a company to be the number one material risk to the airline. There's physical risks. Anyone want to hazard a guess the elevation of Taieri Airport in Dunedin? Taieri's in the Tairi Plains just south of Dunedin. So the elevation there, it's quite a way inland. Anyone want to give it a guess? 4 feet. So it's 4 feet. And Invercargill, where I'm from originally, of course, is actually, parts of it are actually below sea level. Many of the airports that we fly to are actually at sea level. In the case of Invercargill, slightly below. Dunedin just slightly above. And of course, or thereabouts. Even Auckland Airport, with the floods that we had in January, we actually had seawater coming up through the drains on the tarmac because of the storm surge. You know, the problem with when there's low pressure comes over. You know, when there's the low pressure, that's the weight of the atmosphere. Simply means there's less air above us, so that's low pressure. So it's not pushing down on us. You sort of remember, it's a bit hard for us as an organism to realise how much pressure is actually on us, from the air. It's 14.7 pounds, so say there's 15 pounds of air pressure on us, right? And the average human skin, I've got a bit more skin than others, is about 3,000 inches, so therefore there's 45,000 pounds of air pushing on us as we're sitting here at the moment. It's almost incomprehensible because we can't feel it. So we don't get it, but we can't feel it. But the point here is that when there's low pressure, there's less pushing down on us. And when that happens, the sea rises up because it's being pushed down by the weight of the atmosphere above it. And so when a low comes over, there's less air and the sea rises up. And that's what actually happened in the floods in Auckland. And so you get the physical risks of sea level rising. The atmosphere, of course, is about moving heat around, transferring heat. And so you get more energetic atmosphere, and so you get more turbulence and you get more significant weather and that sort of thing. The other problem we have is transitory risks, or when you transition to a new way of doing things. And one of the problems that we have in the country at the moment is still working out what the policies need to be to counteract this issue. In other words, realising we need policies, processes, procedures, regulation, etc., that will actually help solve the problem. There's also our shareholders who invest their money in the airline, and of course they have a view about this, and they recognise, as does their insurers, that this is a major issue as well. So we have to consider those things, not just physical risks, but transitory risks as well. And from a business perspective, that all adds up to dollars, such as things as increased operational costs, distressed assets, the concept of physical damage because of the weather, carbon pricing, the cost of carbon and how it's taxed, government policy, changes in demand, changes in consumer sentiment. Young people today often make decisions based on ethical sourcing. They want to know that a company is doing the right thing, either by the community that they live in or the environment in which they operate. And so these are really important, and they will actually define what the customer wants, and we deliver products that the customer needs or wants, and as a consequence of that we have to consider that as part of it. And then there's litigation and liability, and of course investor financing and insurance. So in 2020, Air New Zealand committed to a net zero carbon emissions by 2050. In other words, what are we doing about it? And have set an interim science-based target to reduce carbon intensity by nearly 30% by 2030. So that's not too far away because we're in 2023 now. And so we've got a significant bit of work to do between now and then. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these things that we're thinking about. The first one is the concept of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. Now, this is the idea where you, and I'll go more deeply into it, but this is where you have a non-carbon based fuel that will actually power the aeroplane. Next generation aircraft, and I'm going to talk about that too shortly, and this is the new types of aeroplanes that we're going to see flying in New Zealand that will have it's called zero emissions aircraft, so therefore they have no effect or very little effect on the carbon outcome. The concept of buying new aeroplanes, so they're renewing your fleet, creating operational efficiencies. There's a lot of inefficiencies in the system. I'll talk a little bit about towards the end of the presentation and some of the things that we're we're going to be doing. But I'll give you an example how inefficient it is. I did a flight a number of years ago in partnership with United Airlines, the FAA, Boeing, Rolls-Royce, GE and Qantas, Singapore Airlines and Cathay Pacific. We all did these flights. The great thing about the Pacific, it's such a huge part, excuse me, huge bit of airspace, and we can do things that you would not be able to do if you're flying across the continental United States or up into Europe and that sort of thing. And so we did this optimised flight in a 777-200. And what that means is that we were not constrained by anything. So we made arrangements with the other operators at Auckland Airport and the airport company and Airways to push back when we wanted to push back, to taxi out when we wanted to taxi out, and then take off. We actually got our takeoff clearance as we were leaving the gate. And then we lined up on the runway and we took off, and instead of following what's called a SID, a standard instrument departure, we just sort of 500 feet and we just sort of turned the aeroplane in the direction that we wanted to go, and we floated across the Pacific and manoeuvred to take advantage of tailwinds or avoiding headwinds and what have you. And then when we got into San Francisco, or towards San Francisco, we did this descent where we weren't interrupted in any way, so we just glided down. And then it was really quite weird because when we touched down, and nothing was moving at San Francisco, so we were everything had been stopped so that we could get to the gate, which was very adjacent to the runway, I have to say. And then we just parked up, and then we compared the amount of fuel that we burnt on that flight versus the flight just the previous day. And there was a couple of small differences between those flights, the weight of the aircraft and the weather, but we worked out what those differences are. And when we took those differences, the difference in the fuel burn of those two flights was 7 tonnes. So I burnt 7 tonnes less fuel on the flight that I did because it was completely optimised. And what that tells you is how inefficient the system actually is. And that was quite a long time ago, and we fly there once every day. So imagine the amount of fuel that could have been saved, and the carbon that would have been avoided being emitted into the atmosphere if we'd have been able to take advantage of that even since then. And then there's the concept of removing carbon out of the atmosphere, and that's actually quite interesting. And it's probably not something that Air New Zealand necessarily may get into, but it's something that I think that certainly people need to think quite hard about. The task is extremely ambitious, and we've actually put that out to our investors and to the market just in the last few days. We distributed a sustainability report, and I did mean to mention that Kiri Hannafin, unfortunately, she's got a family issue at the moment, so she can't be here. And she did really want to be here, and she would have been able to talk much better than I would about the sustainability report, because she basically authored it. And her and I do sustainability. I spend most of my time thinking about aeroplanes and fuel and decarbonising and what have you, and Kiri thinks of all of the wider issues around sustainability, such as what I'm doing as well, but also waste and social engagement and what have you. And sorry that she's not here today. But there is a lot of tension in the business and also in the community about how, not just the aviation community, the airline industry, about how this is going to be achieved. Because the reality is that we want to go from a certain level of carbon intensity, so that's the amount of CO2 emitted per what we call revenue tonne kilometre, in other words, the amount of revenue per tonne per kilometre. Our current trajectory is going to deliver about 11%, but we need to get by 2030 another nearly 18% on top of that. And so to get to that is going to be quite difficult. The first way we're going to do it is by buying sustainable aviation fuel. SAF is at the moment you get crude, it's dug up out of the ground, it's refined, turned into jet fuel, which is just flash kerosene, and then put into the plane. And so that's what you can see on the bottom. What we have to do is have what's called a drop-in fuel, and so that, because you don't want to be in a situation where you've got a plane that's a green plane or a SAF plane, and it requires you to fill up with certain SAF, at a certain airport, and of course if it's not available at a certain airport, then you've got a problem. So you have to have a fuel that can be dropped in to the tanks on top of existing Jet A1. And at the moment, the ratio, the maximum blend ratio is 50%. So that's the way it works at the moment. Some of the fuels, the early generation SAF fuels, and I did the world's first second generation biofuel flight in a 747, and that flight was really interesting because the feedstock was a seed called jatropha, or from a plant called jatropha, which grows in Africa. So I went to Tanzania, got some of the seed, had it crushed, and out of that comes a lipid vegetable oil, sent it to Houston, turned it into jet fuel, brought it down to this is totally ungreen, of course, brought it down to New Zealand, had it blended 50-50, and then put it into a tank on a wing of a 747. So one out of the 4 engines was flying on the SAF, and the other 3 was flying on Jet A1. What was interesting is that for the same amount of thrust, the engine was burning less fuel. So that's the first thing. So it had more calorific, what they call calorific value. The second thing is its freezing point was extremely low, which is really what you do want, and sort of avoid the British Airways scenario. And then the third thing, that's where 777 got iced up in its fuel system in London. And then the third one is it was extremely light. So a litre of jet fuel weighs about 800 grams. A litre of water is 1 kilo, of course, and a litre of jet fuel is typically around about 800 grams, and this stuff came in at about 72 grams, or 700 grams, I should say. And in fact, far too light for the fuel quantity indicating system in the aeroplane to actually detect the amount of fuel that was in the tanks, and that's one of the reasons why you have to have a drop-in fuel, so that you don't upset the fuel quantity indicating system in the plane, and also some of the parts of the plane and what have you. But anyway, the trick here is to obviously find a sustainable feedstock, and that's really quite a challenge. Often being discussed in New Zealand is the concept of the woody biomass. I'm just not 100% sure there is enough of that. And also the reality is, of course, you're competing now as well, because the trucking industry wants green diesel. And of course, they can put green jet fuel in almost into their trucks, and they'd be very happy. And of course, I wouldn't be, because I wouldn't be able to get my hands on it. And then, turn those feedstocks into SAF, and you've got to deliver at least 80% reduction in the carbon life cycle, because it's not just about the SAF itself; it's actually producing the SAF, and it's got to be carbon positive as part of that process. The problems with SAF, it's very hard to come by at the moment. So it's not produced in any great scale in the world. It's around about 3 to 5 times more expensive. So the question is, are the customers going to pay for it? And there's been some questions asked of the airline in the last week off the back of the profit announcement. When are the prices going to come down? If we're going to start spending a lot more money on SAF, it's going to be hard to drive the prices down. One of the problems we have is that not everybody approaches SAF in the same way. Not all governments do. And where it becomes commercially viable, it's particularly viable at the moment in California and also in Scandinavia. Well, we do fly to California, we don't fly to Scandinavia. But both of those areas, or states in the case of California, and area in the case of Scandinavia, have really good, very positive policies that actually induce airlines and producers to produce SAF. The sustainability of the feedstock, of course, and it needs to be scaled up quite significantly. We'll actually talk to the guys across the Tasman. We compete very vigorously with the guys with the red tail, the kangaroo on it. They've been in a bit of spot of bother over the last week or so. But when it comes to sustainability, we'll park the commercial conversation at the door and actually sit down and say, how can we work together to buy SAF for the region? Because they've got scale. They're 4 times Air New Zealand size. So, the reality is we shouldn't look past having a conversation with them to say, how can we actually create a SAF system in the region? The other thing we need to do too is encourage the New Zealand government to think more deeply about setting up a sustainable fuel system in New Zealand, which will include sustainable aviation fuel. The reality is that we've done a deal with MB, and they're funding, and we are funding part of it, and they are funding a feasibility study to work out whether or not there is a viable sustainable aviation fuel system in New Zealand can be created. So 10% SAF by 2030 across the network, and as I've said, we're going to focus in on domestic production, importing it where we can, and of course it's an import system now into New Zealand, so there's no refinery here in New Zealand. So the ships come to Marsden Point. Why is it up there? Because it's one of New Zealand's few deep water ports, so the big ships can get up there, and then it goes into the tank, and then it comes down what's called the wrap, which is the pipe. It's 10 centimetres in diameter. The product comes down the pipe at 2 metres a second, so it takes 24 hours to get to Wiri, where there's a big green set of tanks there, and then it kind of goes into out to the tanks that are at the airport and then into the plane. You don't have a tanker turning up and putting SAF into the aeroplane, you put the SAF into the system. And that's actually what happens in Los Angeles at the moment. So United Airlines are buying SAF and they're putting it into their planes, but they actually can't put it directly into the plane because you get it out of the hydrant in the ground. And so you actually have to put it into the system. So Air New Zealand's planes, when they come down from Los Angeles at the moment, are actually flying on a minute amount of SAF that's in there. We didn't pay for it, but we can't get the credit for it either, because it belongs to United Airlines. And so the concept of international uplift, of course, New Zealand imports is the idea of actually buying a tanker load of SAF and having it put into the system. And then the problem then becomes how do you follow the molecule, but that's a commercial conversation for another day. And then strong advocacy and collaboration, as I say, with other carriers, and also advocacy with the government about getting a better outcome. So SAF is a big part of the solution. The next one is the concept of renewing the fleet. Excuse me. The L747, the Queen of the Skies. I think I saw on the quiz. I was on an aeroplane last week flying from Wellington to Auckland after doing some road shows after the profit announcement. And I saw there was a quiz there, and it was what aeroplane was called the Ritz of the Skies, and of course it was the old 747-200 when we started flying to London back in the 80s. But, there's quite small engines compared to what we see on the big aeroplane today, on the 777, but still you burn a lot of fuel and relatively inefficient compared to the 777, which you can see there, which, is an aeroplane that's far more efficient. And then you get to the 787, which relatively runs on the smell of an oily rag. And then even better when we get the next lot of aeroplanes, which is the 787-10, and our next couple will be -9s, and then the ones after that probably will be -10s. So engine efficiency benefits, though, are actually approaching practical limits. Where engines used to be relatively over-engineered, they're very optimised now, and so you can't sort of really, there's not a lot of more efficiencies that can be gained out of that. And so there'll be new technology that'll be required to do that. It's not really relevant to the slide, but I've actually asked Boeing. Boeing they've got a bit of a skunk works, the idea that they've got a sort of a secret lab somewhere. And we've got a long relationship with Boeing, and I was talking to them the other day about the idea of thinking about shark skins. The swimmers use shark skin type suits. And so we're doing some thinking around whether or not we can have an application of a shark skin to reduce drag on the skin of the aircraft, in actual fact, and to energise the boundary layer. So those are the sorts of things that we're actually thinking about as well. Next generation aircraft technology. I won't go into too much detail. Hydrogen. So we are looking. I'll talk about the companies that we're looking at the moment, but there's two fundamental technologies that are going to deliver the outcome for the short range fleet or the domestic fleet. SAF is really the only answer for the existing fleet. In fact, it's the only answer for aircraft. I'm taking delivery of a 787 in September, October next year. That aeroplane will have a return on investment for 21 or 22 years. And so therefore, and it'll have to be powered on a liquid fuel of which the engines extract energy out of that. And so therefore, it's SAF is the answer for the next 25 years for that. They're not going to be recertified, they're not going to be changed, the technology's not going to change on those aircraft, so we're stuck with it. But there is new technologies that are coming which will take us forward for the shorter range aircraft. First one's hydrogen. Hydrogen is easy to actually produce. You take water, you run an electric current through it, and so you split out the oxygen and the hydrogen. It's through electrolysis, and as a consequence of that, that's what you get. You get hydrogen, and then what you can do with the hydrogen is use it. You can either use it as a liquid fuel, and that's a bit of a problem really because it's not very efficient, or you can use it as a fuel to generate electricity and then use the electricity to power the engines. So those are the two ways that you can use hydrogen. And Airbus are working quite hard at the moment on a hydrogen-powered aircraft, and it's something that we're probably going to be very interested in the not too distant future. And then the other one, of course, is the concept of battery, but batteries are very heavy and they don't get any lighter as the flight goes on, which is, where, as I said before, the 787 gets 100 kilos lighter every 70 seconds or so. Well, the battery-powered aircraft doesn't get any lighter, and then all of a sudden the power dries up. So they're good for a certain range, but they're quite heavy relative to the amount of payload that you can carry. But one way of actually dealing with that is using a hybrid, like a hybrid car, either having SAF or hydrogen that can supplement the battery power as well. And there's a number of aircraft that are looking at that are being produced or considered at the moment that have that technology. New Zealand is actually ideally suited to adopt zero emissions because of the range of the flights that we do, in other words, the distance. And we have a high degree, remember, basically it's either it's electricity to charge up the batteries or electricity to produce the hydrogen. Now, I was in the office not too long ago, and an airport company rang up and says, "Oh, we're thinking of shifting the airport." And I said, "Oh, okay, cool. And what do you want?" And they said, "Well, quite like to know from you what it is you think is important from an Air New Zealand perspective." So I said, "Oh, well, there's two things: good supply of water, and I'd expect you to have a relationship with your energy supplier to be able to deliver green electricity at the cost per kilowatt hour that's acceptable to Air New Zealand." And they thought it was a bit like I was on a different planet, because they were expecting me to talk about hangars and runways and taxiways and control towers, and I'm not actually interested in control towers either, because there's a digital solution for a control tower these days. And of course what I'm talking about here is the ability to produce either charge up electric aeroplanes or produce hydrogen. And to do that, you need electricity that's been produced by a company that does renewable energy. And the price of hydrogen is based directly on the price of a kilowatt hour of electricity. So it needs to be at the right price. And so we're very lucky in New Zealand that we have a high degree of renewable energy. And it's not too long, and it's government policy in actual fact in the next few years to obviously get to a point where it's 100%. So that's exciting. And the other thing too is that, because we're a sinuous, long nation with some relatively remote parts of New Zealand that are not easy to get to, and that's been challenged a bit lately, with the floods down in the Hawke's Bay and Gisborne. The ability of air connectivity is hugely important for this country, and as you can see there's limited substitutes as well. But what we're going to do in the meantime, to have a hydrogen-powered or a electric-powered aircraft flying around is all very well, but to get to that, we've actually got to convince a whole lot of people that it's actually quite a good idea. Notwithstanding, part of that is the travelling public, of course. But we've also got to have we've got to have government policy right, we've got to have regulatory framework, we've got to have CAA our regulator understanding what it means to be flying a alternatively powered aircraft, etc. It's really quite interesting. You know, we were talking about refuelling a hydrogen-powered aircraft, and they said, "Oh, engineers need to be involved in that." And I said, "Well, hang on. You know, when you fill up a plane today, the lack of fuel in a plane does not make a plane unairworthy. It just simply means that it can't fly very far. So refuelling an aircraft is not an engineering function; it's an airport function, or a pilot function, in actual fact, in a light aircraft. And so the upshot of it is that you know, those are the sorts of thinking that we have to challenge, because there's people making assumptions about what this all has to be about. And so what we want to do in order to replace the Q300s, which come here into Tauranga quite a bit, we're going to have to make a decision at some point in the future to replace those aircraft, because they're not producing those anymore. They haven't for some time. And they're going to come end of life, and the aeroplane that we want to replace them with is going to have to be a next generation aircraft that is zero emissions. But we've got to convince people, the system, like the government, CAA, Airways Corporation, the travelling public, the community, the refuelling organisations, the airports that support us, and that sort of thing, that this is something that, and start learning about how to do it. So what Air New Zealand has decided to do is to actually, by 2026, be flying a commercial demonstrator aircraft in the network between a couple of city pairs, and you can see pictures of the ones that we're actually looking at. And you know, we are going to be flying those, and so it's quite exciting. And so you guys, if you get into it, might be flying one of those things, you know, in the not too distant future. I'll be the next gen aircraft. There's two parts to it. There's the commercial demonstrator part on the green on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side there's the long-term partners. Those little aeroplanes are not going to replace the Q300, clearly. They're going to be providing us with the testing the system. When we get to 2030, we're going to have made a decision that actually we need a 40 or 50 seater flying around the country. And they're probably going to come from Airbus, ATR, Heart Aerospace, which is up in Sweden, Universal Hydrogen. Those are the sort of four key manufacturers at the moment. Universal Hydrogen has got an ATR, actually. They've got an ATR and a Q300 flying around. Airbus, as I said, are working on an ATR, are working on a battery hybrid aircraft. And Heart Aerospace is similarly doing something like that. I'll be off to the States. Correction, I've got to go to Toulouse to visit Airbus, then I go up to Bordeaux, and I will visit one of the companies up there, and then I'll go down to across to the States and into Canada, and I'll have a look at the others, and when I come back we'll make a decision. We'll get it down to 2, and then we'll make a decision later in the year, early next year, about which demonstrator it's going to be. They're 5 million, these things here, they're not cheap. The smallest ones, you know, you're looking at around about $5 million. And we need 3, because we need one being flown, the other one either probably being charged, and the other one being maintained, you know, so that'll be interesting. So it's quite a big investment. The other one, the final slide tonight, is just the concept of operational efficiencies, and I talked a little bit about that before. I threw this slide in because there's a few pilots in the room, and the role that pilots can play, excuse my coughing. The upshot of it is that, as I said before, 7 tonnes on a San Francisco, imagine what could have been saved. And sometimes you get pilots saying, you know, we even have this challenge a little bit, or we assume that guys aren't, you know, really connected into it, because sometimes you'll hear the guys saying, and if they're flying in the Q300, oh, if I, you know, save 20 kilos here, you know, you'll burn that in 6 seconds. You know, in your 787, you know, taxiing around and starting up, you know, when we start the engines and taxi out, we burn 320 kilos or so to get out to the runway, you know, and that's the amount of fuel that they need to fly from here to Rotorua, you know, something like that. So, but, you know, when you actually ask the pilots, you know, what's their attitude towards sustainability, and of course the younger guys in the airline are extremely engaged on this, and they want us to be doing the right thing. So there's quite a bit of work for us to do in this space, and there's still some opportunities. So it's a bit hard to read that slide, but when I was a youngster on the Friendship, we used to taxi around single engine all the time, and I'm wanting to see it's fallen out of favour for some reason on some of the turboprop fleets. So we're going to bring that back in again shortly. So taxiing in and taxiing out. The auxiliary power unit in the tail burns about 450 kilos an hour. So we've got to stop using those and using more electricity at our airports and plugging that in. And reducing the amount of fuel that we tanker. So sometimes we actually have to tanker fuel to other places because it's not available, but sometimes we do it simply on the basis of cost, because it's actually cheaper to take the fuel up to a place than it is to buy the fuel in that place. And we've actually got to make a decision. Is that a good idea? And quite frankly, the travelling public wouldn't be particularly impressed with that. So that's a challenge for us. Getting our cruising speeds right, optimising the speed at which we fly. Don't go early, or don't get in early. You know, don't go fast. If you can slow down and save fuel, that's a good idea. Lowest emissions altitude. We're looking at trialling the idea of descending at a steeper angle to the runway, or on the descent, what's called a 4-degree descent profile. Reduce the amount of discretionary fuel that people are carrying, and you do that by giving them more confidence in the flight planning system. And we've just introduced a new flight planning system into New Zealand called Flight Keys. It's only the third one that's been in place since I've been with the airline in 38 years, and it's very, very good. Using visual approaches, required navigation performance. This is where you use the GPS approach to bring you down quite a lower altitude, and you can do a curved trajectory. And those are good for noise as well. It keeps noise away from certain areas, but often will result in an approach that's done with much lower power. And then the concept of single engine pushback. And then, of course, in the jets is the use of GPUs, the power on the runway, as I talked about, or at the gate. Slightly reducing the amount of flap that we use for landing. So there's a couple of flap settings on this, for example, on the 787, 25 and 30. If you do 25 versus 30, you save about 120 kilos on the approach, because it just produces less drag of the aeroplane. You obviously land a little bit faster. It's about 5 knots faster, and you've got to consider that. Remember, energy is the square of the speed, so therefore you're carrying more energy to the runway. You've got to make sure you can dissipate it on touchdown. And then, of course, reduced acceleration altitude. So what that means is that instead of taking off and then getting to 1,500 feet and then cleaning the aeroplane up and that sort of thing, we've actually just introduced it on the A320, is that as soon as they get airborne and you lower the nose at 900 feet, and we're starting to accelerate. And so that's saving a huge amount of fuel. And then the other one is idle reverse. So the concept of where you select, instead of selecting full reverse, making a lot of noise and consuming a lot of fuel, just doing a lot less of reverse thrust. And it's actually good for the reverses. The reverses on the 787 are made by GOODAS, and they're worth $10 million each. The engines are $33 million each, and the reverses, which is the cowlings around the outside of the engine, are actually worth $10 million each. So you've got $20 million out there. And it's quite harsh out there, you know, when you select reverse thrust, there's a lot of machinery that happens to make the airflow be directed back at a 45-degree angle out the sides of the engine, and there's a lot of mechanical stuff in there, and that they get up the ghost every now and again, and they're expensive to repair. So that's a good reason. You just got to make sure that you do actually use it when you should use it, which of course is on a wet runway. So there's a few options there as well. So a bit of a walk through what the challenge is and some of the things that we're thinking about as an airline to deliver a sustainability outcome. It's considered by the airline to be the biggest challenge that we've got ahead of us. There's a whole lot of other things at the moment: supply chain, capability, cost of fuel and cost increases along the airline. But in the long term, we have to think about what sustainability means is that you are enduring. The airline's just coming up to 90 mumble years. We want it to be around for 180 years. If we're going to do that, we've got to make some really quite tough decisions about what the future looks like. We're thinking quite hard about that. So I hope you've enjoyed that. It's been a pleasure, and I'm happy to take some questions if there's anybody wants to ask me anything before we move on to the next thing of the evening. yes.
Have you had any contact with them?
Yes, we're in partnership with them. So Lanzatech and Air New Zealand are, so we're looking at, Lanzatech are actually part of the team that are looking at the feasibility of a sustainable aviation fuel in New Zealand. So Lanzatech, MB, Air New Zealand and other participants are in that part of that the feasibility study. So it's actually, the technology is very exciting and very viable, no doubt about it. Yeah.
Looking at those aircraft you had, for coming to replace the Q300s, what size are those? That doesn't look very big, but it's about the size of a Metroliner.
No, smaller than that. So the biggest one's about the size of a Metroliner. The smaller ones are probably about the size of the Air Tourer. Yeah, so probably, and we'll start off not with passengers, it'll be with cargo. So we'll be one pilot and about 600 kilos of cargo is what we're aiming for those early aircraft. But as I say, that's not about a commercial operation. That's about testing the aviation system to deliver the sustainable outcome in the future. Last question. Here we go.
Is your view also toward autonomous aircraft? Those aircraft are autonomous?
I'm a fan of looking at autonomous aircraft. And turkeys don't normally, vote for an early Christmas, but the reality is that I hold the view. I'm the chair of the IATA Operations Advisory Council, and I get myself into a spot of bother by challenging the industry to think more deeply about autonomously, either remotely or autonomously flown aircraft. And the reason for that, and it is a bit of a stretch, I'll admit that. But the president of the society, Sean Johnson, is the CEO of Merlin, and that's exactly what he is doing at the moment. And he was up in the Mojave Desert recently, in the hangar next door to Universal Hydrogen. So he was sneaking around Universal Hydrogen, doing a bit of spying for me on what they're up to up there. But and of course Merlin, which were doing their work in Parapram and are now up at Kerikeri, are looking at flying an autonomously flown caravan, Cessna Caravan. But the reason why I'm a fan of getting pilots out of the flight deck, and it's going to take many decades for that to happen, there's no doubt about that, but we have to realise that pilots are often poor decision makers or poor actors, and when it comes to safety, net I think in the long run safety would be enhanced if you took you had less pilots in the flight deck. And people sort of get quite perturbed about that comment, but I think of it like this. When you first, I remember in Invercargill, there was great excitement when I was a kid because the H&J Smiths, which is the department store down there, got the first escalator in Southland. And we all went up the escalator and then we went down the stairs. It was only an up escalator, there was no down escalator. So you had to go up the escalator, down the stairs and then up the escalator, and this was exciting. But there was also a lift there, and inside the lift was a guy driving it. And so he would do that and you would go up or down. So you get onto a lift and there was an operator operating the lift. Last time I looked, the lifts just did what aeroplanes do, oppose the force of gravity. The physics of the aeroplane being lifted into the air are no different to the cable that holds onto a lift. Then, of course, you go to a lift and you press a button and to say what floor you want to go to, and there's no person there. And now, of course, you go to a modern office building and it says, who do you want to see? And it says, get into room F. And you go into room F and there are no buttons in the lift at all. And so I use that as an analogy. It's a bit of a stretch, but it's an analogy about how technology, which is exactly opposing the force of gravity, has got away from a person operating it to a system operating it. And I think that's probably what the future looks like. Anyway.
I was going to say, and there's a rumour that they're looking for single pilot operations between the
to be condiments along with the dog.
Yeah, the manufacturers are actually doing work on the concept of single pilot operations. There's no doubt about that. Yeah, that's right, that's right. But I mean, you know, the reality is pilots are going to be around for a long time. There's no doubt about that. Thanks, guys. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Good night.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much, David. And if you're flying to Sydney at 6 o'clock in the morning, David will be your pilot. So he's got to drive back tonight and get ready to fly off to Sydney in the morning. So thank you very much, David, for making the time to come here. Yeah, it's an interesting situation. The question that you could ask is, you know, does an airline discourage people to fly? But what we were seeing is actual conscious efforts to be more green and to go forward. And airports in New Zealand, such as Christchurch Airport, are actually a world leading, like they won the first airport in the world to get a level 4 accreditation by Airports Council International, and they're working in tandem with the airlines. I'd now like to move on to the second part of what we're going to do. And we're going to award the Brian Lockstone Media Award, or Rosemary's going to award it. And I'll just give you a little bit of a background. So this is an award that our branch created for the first time last year, and it's to recognise Brian Lockstone. So Brian was born in New Plymouth in 1944, and his interest in aviation was evident from an early age. He entered into the Air Force as a trainee pilot, but his eyesight was such that partway through that training he couldn't pursue that as a career. Brian then became a junior reporter with the Taranaki Daily News, and from there to the Auckland Star. From the 1970s on, he wrote for that paper from the Parliamentary Press Gallery, and he later became the Chief Press Officer for Prime Minister Robert Muldoon. While working in Parliament, Brian met his wife Rosemary Banks, who's with us this evening, and Rosemary's sitting next to David. Brian subsequently left his role in Parliament to accompany his wife on her diplomatic postings in various countries around the world. While in the Solomon Islands, Brian worked for the Civil Aviation Authority, and subsequently while in Australia he worked for both Ansett and Qantas. On later postings in different parts of the world, like France and the United States of America, where he was working with Rosemary, he started to concentrate more on his writing, his aviation writing, and he was very supportive and involved in the New Zealand Aviation Historical Society. Brian co-authored a number of books, and in the Journal of the Aviation Historical Society there are many articles that he's written. So Brian's also been a member of the Bay of Plenty branch, because there are no branches of the New Zealand division in the United States, so he's actually been a member of our branch, and he was the first person to give the Jean Batten Award address 5 years ago. So Des said that he actually came all the way back from the USA to give it. There were probably some other reasons why he came back to New Zealand at that time. And the Bay of Plenty, our branch, are privileged to be able to support the contribution that he made and to recognise it through this annual award. So I'd just like to invite Rosemary, his wife, to come up and to say a few words if she'd like to, and then Rosemary is going to present the award to the person.
Tēnā koutou katoa. A real pleasure to be with you all here tonight for the Jean Batten Dinner of 2023, and not only all of you, but Lila and Kat. So thank you very much, David, for the invitation and for the introduction. And first of all, a really big thank you to the Tauranga branch of the Royal Aeronautical Society for the way that you remembered and honoured my late husband, Brian Lockstone. I can't think of a better way to keep fresh his memory than through this award for aviation writing and promotion, because aviation and journalism were the two guiding rails of his life. Aviation, I have to say, did come first, and journalism followed when, as David explained, he had a promising start in the RNZAF cut short by his less than perfect eyesight. That was a bit of disappointment, but it was one that he turned into a lifetime of service to aviation and authorship. And anybody who knew him would know that he loved every aspect of aviation, including when it pops up every now and again in literature. And so one of his favourite poems, and you may know it, was called High Flight is the title, was written by a young Canadian airman who was training to fly in World War II. And he described, at the age of 19, he described his ecstatic experience of learning to fly. So I'm going to share just the opening words. Some of you may know these. And it goes, "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on silver, laughter-silvered wings." And he concludes the poem with some other lovely images. He wrote, "I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, the high untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God." So I like to think that Brian's spirit also slipped the earthen sword. Now, I've succeeded in keeping you in suspense for almost 2 minutes, so it really is time now, and a real privilege for me, to announce the winner of the 2023 Brian Lockstone Media Award. I should do a dramatic pause here and make you wait another minute, but I won't. It's Gary Benner. So congratulations. Now, since Gary's been taking photographs of us all, this is going to have to be a selfie moment, I think. Congratulations, Gary, and thanks again, everybody, for establishing this award, which you've won by doing what would have delighted Brian, helping to preserve the collective memory of our aviation history and promoting its future. So, again, congratulations.
It's a rather small stage up here, actually. So this is a local award, and I'd just like to tell you a little bit about Gary and why the committee thought that he was an appropriate person to win this, or the appropriate person. So Gary's a committee member of our local branch. He's a business owner, and he's a company director of his own company, which is called GOODAS Films. Gary has a long-standing passion for aviation, and his father was a Spitfire pilot in England during World War II, before returning to the family farm near Te Puke, where Gary was raised. And Gary is an architect of software products as well, and he currently assists some of his software products. He helps manage some of the major air shows across New Zealand. He's an active contributor to the local film industry and was a recent winner in the Bay of Plenty 48-hour film challenge as a team leader, sound, lighting, and in post-production. So those are the things he does, but some of the things that he's done for us, what Gary has done is he's created the means to record the sessions that we have, the branch meetings, but not only those, but also things like the Aviation Careers Expo, where we have young secondary school students and other activities that we do. So he's been recording the past, he's recording current activities, and he's also recording things such as the future, where aviation's going to do, so he's crossing that over. He edits the events, he records them, and then he spends a lot of time editing them. He's even he's been doing it in multiple places at the same time. He was recording Bruce's presentation about flying into the Antarctic in Hercules over at the Aero Club recently, while he was also, his equipment was also recording people upstairs in the Boeing room when we were doing another recording. He's also managed to conduct recordings when he's the presenter himself, and if you go to YouTube and you look under the branch, and then you'll find there's a publication called Spitfires Don't Float, and that's an actual story of Gary's father's operations as a fighter pilot during the Second War, but also the situation of coming back and what it was like to come back to the farm at Te Puke, both for Gary's father and for other members of his family. Yeah, so Gary, we'd just really like to thank you very much for what you've done for us. And what's also happening is that the other branches of the Royal Aeronautical Division across New Zealand don't have the capability that we have, and that they are looking to Gary to actually guide the way that the New Zealand division operates. So some of the presentations that Gary's filmed have actually been used by other branches as for their branch meetings, and they're looking at whether or not, things like this, whether we could be live streaming it, whether we could be recording it, and then in different ways that we can be using these. So Gary, you've been a great, and also this evening with me helping set up and making sure the AV is going to work. It's a huge thank you. So I'd just like to, if you'd like to say a few words, you're welcome to do so.
Thank you, David. With all good things, it actually is a team effort. And David, who we used to actually work at the local Polytech together some years ago, has enabled me to utilise the skills that I've built up over a period of time to apply to aviation. He mentioned my father, who served overseas in World War II. Came back, had 5 boys, but none wanted to be on the farm. 3 actually got their private pilot's licence, but I was unable to due to an irregular heartbeat, which by the time the doctors fixed that, I had a family and a business and no money. The Jean Batten Award is interesting because I share her birthday, 15th of September. Also, one of my great aunts was the librarian in Rotorua. In fact, she was the original librarian in Rotorua. And she mentioned through that role her meeting of various people like Jean Batten, I think George Bernard Shaw and a few others. So Rotorua must have been the place to be in those days. Thank also my wife Julie, the home team, helps keep me going, keeps me on the straight and narrow, and all of the other members of the society here, and none the least those that also spend the time preparing the talks that I can record. Having done a talk myself recently, I know how much effort goes into it, and I'm just glad to be able to add my little bit to record that so many others can share and enjoy that knowledge and experience that to pass on. So thank you to all the team.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. Well, thank you, everybody. That concludes our presentations for this evening. I'd just like to thank David for driving down here this evening. He's got to drive back again and get ready to go for a fly in the morning. And hopefully you'll be flying that aircraft as sustainably as possible in the morning. And I'd also, Rosemary, thank you very much for taking the time to come up from Christchurch to spend time with us, and you're welcome any other time you'd like to come as well. And I'd just like to thank everybody else that's come here tonight. It's been a really interesting presentation from David and the others. I'd just also like to acknowledge Classic Flyers. They are real partners of us as an aeronautical society. When we run the Careers Expo, they always give a prize, such as a ride in the Stearman or a Harvard, and they've been a fantastic team. And compared to lots of museums around the place, this one's actually a very vibrant business centre, and they do an amazing job. So Jenny and the team that looked after us tonight have done a really nice job. So that concludes our proceedings, and thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you.